revelation in terms of out of whirlwind like thunder, and his speech like he did to Moses on Sinai. So these are called theophanies, which we will see today as well. So Job is saying how I will answer him, how I will choose my words. For though if I were right, I could not answer him, I would have to implore the mercies of my judge. If I called and he answered me, I could not believe that he was listening to my voice. So apparently, Job doesn't believe that he's being heard, or he's not sure, at least that seems from the text. And secondly, he's not sure if he will be able to answer God. So still in all this mess, in all these miseries, he still believes that there is God and he's enormously powerful. So at no point Job is becoming an atheist or some other kind of follower of other religions. So Job is faithful, and Satan is being destroyed throughout this throughout this dialogue. I would like to read a passage from Job 12. And this passage is particularly important because Job occurs in the section of wisdom literature. And in Jewish wisdom, in Jewish poetry or wisdom writings, wisdom is a desirable thing to some extent. And it's, I think it's valued high in Proverbs, and maybe Psalms as well. The wise ones are somehow held in high esteem, or people of God are called to be wise. But Job is a bit different. With Job's response in Job 12, Job destroys quite a lot of established human institutions, not just the ones who think they are wise in their own wisdom. But he also says in Job chapter 12, verse 6, with him are strength and sound wisdom. The misled and misleaders belong to him. Misleaders belong to him. He makes counselors walk barefoot and makes fool of judges. He loosens the bond of kings and binds their lions with girdle. He makes priests walk barefoot. So walking barefoot in ancient cultures was an act of shame and submission and humiliation, and overthrows the secure ones. So he takes away the powers of these human kings and priests. He deprives the trusted ones of speech and takes away the discernment of the elders. He pours contempt on nobles and loosens the belt of the strong. He reveals mysteries from darkness and brings the deep darkness into light. He makes the nations great, then destroys them. He enlarges the nations, then he leads them away. So a constant pattern of God giving people respect, power, but at the same time just taking away at the whenever he wills, or however it pleases him. So, but in all this, I think wisdom is regarded not as that of a high virtue as it might have been in the other writings. So this will go on, and then the friends will respond, Zophar and Bildad, and then again the second cycle of speech, and then Eliphaz will speak, then again Job's response, and this goes on. In the third speech, however, the responses of the friends are getting shorter, and in the final speech, in the third cycle, the last friend is just omitted, so he doesn't care to respond, or maybe it has been said already enough, but the speech is not there, so the speech is absent from the text. But then another figure is introduced in the narrative, whose name is Elihu. He is the fourth friend, and occurs in chapter 32 all the way through 38, and then God speaks. So now Elihu is rather younger out of these men, and he speaks out of frustration as well, because he has seen these men go back and forth. And he declares clearly, we do not have time to read his case, but he declares clearly that he was forced to speak because there is no end to these words and this debate, and he is also agitated because of the theological views of these people. He would like to present something different, and he promises in the beginning quite a lot. You can read his speech, He promises to present something different, but in the end, it's quite similar to what it has already been said. And he says, surely God will not act wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. And this is the same question that Bildad asked, what we read the last time, that can God pervert justice? And he's asking the same thing, or he's saying it in a sentence form and not asking it as a question. So a declaration of God being just and at the same time Job being sinful. After all this, God will respond. Now, God's response is really crucial to the book. Without God's response, the book is not complete. And
Sir, I
human
have a
beings are
question.
left. Yeah, please.
Sir, all of his friends judged him as a sinner, but he was not really a sinner. So was that justified to his friends afterwards or not? Like he was not sinner.
The book doesn't say he wasn't sinner. He was blameless. He is not totally, and that's not the main concern, but as far as we know, he was blameless before God. He was offering sacrifices for his children, thinking that they might have sinned, and he was aware that human beings can sin. But also the thing is that does his suffering equal his sin? So I don't think the narrative is clearly saying that he was the purest man of all and he never sinned. He's blameless and his way of life is pleasing to God.
So explain what blameless means.
Blameless would be, in the light of the prologue, that Satan cannot blame him in front of God, at least. I think that can be said safely. If you combine the prologue and then his upright lifestyle, he's not supposed to be accused, but he is accused by the adversary. So that sets the stage for the question raised by Satan. But I don't think Job is totally blameless. Also thinking of Jewish thinking that humanity is prone to sin and suffer. And that's what the friends say as well, that humanity sin. And sometimes Job accepts the possibility that he might have sinned. He says, if I have sinned, you just let me know. Why do you torment me? So Job is aware himself that he is not pure in terms of never committed a sin. But the narrative is pretty strong on this, that his lifestyle was not does not commensurate or does not go well with the amount of suffering that he is going through.
So the issue in Job is not that he's sinless, but when you say blameless, that means that when he sinned, he brought sacrifices to God. Is that what you mean by blameless? So he followed the law in order to take care of his sin. So it doesn't mean that he's sinless, but it does mean that he can't be blamed for not taking care of his sin by bringing it to God, praying for forgiveness, etc. Right? But you're saying that the issue is not whether he's sinless or not, but whether the suffering he's going through is fair compared to other people who sin far more and don't have the kind of suffering that he's going through, and he doesn't think it's fair. Is that correct?
Yes, that's precisely what I was hinting at.
That's very powerful. It's good. Okay, Isaac, you got it?
Yes, sir.
So, and I would just add to that as well, that that's also the issue of divine suffering, theodicy. Are we suffering equal to how we sinned? That's also one issue that's related to justice of God. So, well, I will leave it there. That's another topic in its own right. So then God will answer Job. He will not answer Job, but his answer comes in terms of a challenge. And the challenge is not initiated by God. That's very important to understand. The challenge is initiated by Job himself. He says that he would like to charge a lawsuit against God. In Job, I think 13 verse 19. If you want to write it down, you can write it down for reading it after. I won't mention it again, because then we will be just going back and forth because there are so many connections within the book. But Job desired a lawsuit against God, and he wanted to see God, and God grants him his wish. So it's now it's a legal language. God is going to enter into a court language with Job. And then in 38, chapter 38, God answers Job. So it says from verse 1, chapter 38, verse 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? I think I mentioned it wrong. Read it again. Yeah, so again, chapter 13, verse 19, Job says, who is there who will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die. This verse relate to I just made a minor mistake. The lawsuit language is, I think, in chapter 9. I read it as well on Friday, but the chapter 38, verse 2, relates to Job 13, verse 19, where he says, who is there who will contend with me? And that's a very strong language. And God picks up this language afterwards, and he says, who is this that darkens counsel by word without knowledge? So Job's bold claim that he has knowledge and he has access to some kind of reasoning through which he will make sense of his suffering. God is mocking this kind of claim in the form of a question. And then what comes next is that God tells Job to dress up like a man. So man up, get ready for the war. And the language used is for a hero when he went to war or was going to take up a challenge. So this is God's word to Job that now you will be ready, brace yourself, and I will speak to you, and we will have a court case, or we will fight a lawsuit. Now, the second phrase of verse 3 is very interesting. God says, I will question you and you will make it known to me. So the obvious parallel to questioning is what happens when you question someone.
Yeah, I guess the other person answers.
Yeah, but here God is not seeking an answer. God is seeking an intimate knowledge of the things that he has spoken about. He knows about creation. So what follows is God's creation accounts, how he created the world. But Job already knows it. We already know that there's nothing new that is going to be added to the theology of Job, basically, in terms of knowledge. He has already said quite a lot of things that show that he totally knows how God created the world from Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and what happened afterwards. And we saw the example of this also in Job 3 the other day, that he expressed an intimate knowledge of Hebrew Bible. But here God is not going to go with a Sunday school quiz, who created the world, and Job has to say God. It's more of a intimate knowledge to show Job that he, after all, he's not as wise as he thought, or as wise as God is. So the point is that Job will express the profound information, profound knowledge of the information that he shared, and make known it to God, who achieved all these actions by himself. And then a series of questions start from God, and the reader is still wondering that where is the answer? But that's the answer, that there is answer in the questions. And the reader and Job have to answer these questions for themselves. So the book of Job is not going to tell you everything like in a discourse manner. It's going to make you think and make you challenge, and so that you can also, the readers can participate in reflecting upon these questions. Otherwise, if God just stated what Job has already said, it wouldn't be as reflective, as powerful as it is now. And I think there is a divine wisdom in how these questions are laid out here, and you can clearly see it. There are a few questions that relate to the animal world, how animals work, and then who laid the foundations of the of the earth. And the obvious answer is God. Yeah, so that's what Job is supposed to say as well. But I think the distinction here is that Job knows them already, but Job's theology needs to be repositioned. he needs to be brought back to his knees and just to appreciate the creation of the Creator. Secondly, in the Hebrew Bible, the design of God's creation is an evidence of his presence in the world and his absolute knowledge. And when God answers out of this framework of the design of the cosmos or design of the earth and how everything functions, how the rain comes, especially with the mention of rain, it shows that God is the sustainer of the world, and there is answer in the creation order that we can observe, and that's also written in Romans, where Paul says that these things can point us to God. Now,
Sir, I just want to say something.
Yeah, sure, please.
Sir, I guess just as you said that his theology wasn't need to be repositioned. So I guess he kind of forgot like who God is and what can he do with all of his suffering and all the complaints and judgment his friend were making, and with all that arguments. I guess he some kind of forgot that God is present and God can do everything. So I guess that's how God reminded him.
Yeah, true. He did forget, but I think he didn't forget it intellectually. Uh, he his relationship with God is not that fresh anymore. His theology needs to be not just an intellectual system of thoughts, but it has to be more of a relationship to God, where he's faithful in trusting in all this wisdom as well, not just knowing it by mind. And we will see this kind of nuanced approach that Job will have in the end as well. And also, secondly, all this while we discussed that God's names are used as El, Shaddai, and then there was one more, Eloha. Eloha is also, all these names are used in contexts where God is presented as enormously powerful and all-knowing creator. But when God's speech introduces God, it's turned to Yahweh again, as we saw in the prologue. So there is a message in that as well, that God is speaking as a God who has covenant with his people, the covenantal name of God, Yahweh, which is more intimate and personal, as opposed to the other names which demonstrate his power and his might. And this relationship is what God is going to restore in Job's theology as well, that Job will appreciate God and his works and his design, and in the end will come to worship. But with the rain, you will see that in quite a lot of praise psalms, and also in this the act of God's creation, also in Genesis 1-3, rain is specifically mentioned. So rain is considered as constant, recurring blessing of God, which comes every year. And like you would know why, because of course, rain is important for living, for harvest, for agriculture. And secondly, I think rain is also important as a metaphor for transformation. Places where there is less greenery and depends on rain for grass and for trees to grow, you see a transformation on the level of observable eye as well. And I think rain has significance, that it is seen as God's power of transformation and also life-sustaining activity for humanity and also for animals and plants equally. So God will remind Job of all these things, and God has already challenged Job in the beginning that if you have intimate knowledge of these things, yada, you will make it known to me. You will speak on these matters on a deeper level, not just on the level of how these things are done. Okay, everyone knows that rain comes, but God will ask who is the father of rain, and all these things. All these questions are supposed to point Job back to his relationship with the Creator, and sometimes in a very harsh way. So if you were expecting that in the end Job will, of course you have read the book of Job, but I'm just using rhetorics, that God will come back and say, oh no, poor Job, you suffered so much and I'm sorry. That's not the case here. God wants to show him something different in a more harsher way. and also put him to his place. We also talked about the challenge to wisdom, to human wisdom, and also challenging one's own theology of retributive justice. So retributive justice is that you will sin and God will punish you, right? But the other side of retributive justice is also that if you have righteousness, God will bless you. So then it becomes a mathematical equation where sin equals suffering, and then righteousness, good deeds equal money and blessings and whatever you can understand in terms of prosperity. And both of these equations are defeated. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't punish the wicked. God never said, I'm going to disrupt this this equation. Although it's more nuanced, it's not that simple. For example, in his speech in chapter 38, verse 3, not verse 3, verse 13, I will read from 12, and I will read all the way till 15, and you will see that God is still punishing the wicked. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it take the hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out as a garment. For the wicked, their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. So God is still the enemy of the wicked, or he hates wickedness, but he loves people. And secondly, I think as Christians, it's hard to imagine a world which is not run on the principles of retributive justice, because there will be just chaos, and no one is there to take care of evil, and no one is holding people responsible for their evil acts. And that's also a positive side of retributive justice, and the book of Job does not totally deny it. But the book of Job tells us that suffering always do not mean that you sinned, and the other way also, that if you do righteous deeds, which you should, if you're a follower of Yahweh, as the book of Job, it never promises you material blessings. Rather, it points to a relationship to Yahweh. Then the series of questions will go on, and then in chapter 40, God reminds Job of the sea monsters. It's a rather long, or I think in chapter 41. The final speech of Yahweh is in chapter 41, which reminds Job of the sea monsters, Leviathan. In the ancient cultures, these sea monsters were seen as powers of evil, and God tells him that he controls everything under his power, and reminds Job again of the world order that he's maintaining and how powerful he is. In the end, after hearing all this, in chapter 42 comes one of the high points of the book and the low points of Job's life. It's Job's answer to God, and he's totally defeated. But he's not defeated in front of his friends. He was insistent that he hasn't sinned, and he would still like to enter in a lawsuit with God. He did, and then his confession comes. He says, I know, in chapter 42, verse 42, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. It cannot be interrupted or hindered. Who is that hide counsels without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand. Again, as I mentioned, the battle was not a physical one, but of understanding and discernment and wisdom, as Job had claimed to. And he seems lost and defeated, but happily accepts it. And he says that I uttered, or I uttered what I did not understand. And then he says things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. So this is his cognitive process, his thinking process, how it changed. Now he has accepted, and now he will make a confession, which is also important, very important for the readers as well. He says, "Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and make it known to me." It's the same which God challenged Job in the beginning, and now Job is repeating the same thing, but on a lower level and asking God to teach him wisdom. So no human wisdom is enough, but the wisdom of Yahweh um, is what the humans need. And then he says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you, which is one of my favorite verses in the book of Job. So it's experiencing God firsthand, and that doesn't come easy way. That comes through hardship, suffering, and discernment comes through when you're at low points of your lives. And that's just the way it is. And that's, I think, also the human reality. So by hearing of here, just a report of Yahweh as he had known already. He said, you created me, God, and then he knows that he created the world as well. But the experiential part of it was lacking, that he sees God face to face, not in terms of that he saw God standing before him, but seeing here is a metaphor for feeling his presence and knowing that he is there, I believe. So then not just hearing by someone, as Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar claimed. I showed you that Eliphaz especially made some claims which were quite bold, and those were based on his personal experiences, what he saw, what he observed from the life of the wicked, what he heard from the wisdom of the old, and people like this. But from that movement, and now we have a new movement in the narrative where Job is the one who have seen God and not just heard of him. And that's what I think Job's suffering contributed to his spiritual growth and his theological knowledge, that he is not just a guy who knows doctrines, but he's the guy who knows God. And then he says, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes, which is a sign of humility, acceptance of self-worthlessness. We see repentance in dust and ashes in Jonah as well. And Job has the same kind of repentance, that he accepts the full authority of Yahweh. Afterwards, the Lord says to Eliphaz that you have not spoken, my anger is kindled against you, because you have not spoken what is right about me as my servant Job has. And then he says that Job will offer a sacrifice for you. And then the whole book ends with Job's restoration. And this is very important, that Job's material restoration are not the main focus of the restoration part. His spiritual restoration comes before and has, I believe, more significance in the book than everything he gets in twofold. So that's how the book ends. The book ends, but still leaves the readers with a lot of questions on his own behavior, I believe. As Job has experienced God firsthand, the readers believers, Christian believers especially, are invited to see their suffering as meaningful and not as a torturous process. It can be painful. I'm not denying the painful reality of suffering that people go through, but simply explaining it as sin punishment equation doesn't suffice, according to the book of Job. Now, the book of Job poses questions on you. I think the first question book of Job asks you is if you are wise. And if you are wise in your own eyes, you should be scared, because book of Job tells you that you are foolish, and you have to trust God and know him more if you want to question his behavior according to your wisdom. Secondly, I think also book of Job speaks to people who have hubris, who have pride. God can bring the wise ones to ashes, and he can raise the ones who are lowly of society in this life and in life after, for sure. And the book of Job asks us as humans, why do we have so much pride and why do we have so much self-confidence? I'm not saying that you shouldn't have any self-confidence. We can still talk about God as Job did. He knew already, and we can talk about him responsibly, and he has given us thinking. But the book of Job tells us that we cannot put him into a tight box where he has to fulfill our desires and our standards and expectations. And Book of Job also questions those who think that they are superior to others in any terms, if it's in terms of spiritual blessings or material blessings, or in terms of wisdom, or in terms of educational degrees. And Book of Job really questions this kind of behavior and puts all humanity in one camp where they are all in need of God's wisdom to sustain and to talk about him at all. It's God who initiates the dialogue, not humans who explore him with their cool reasoning and smart reasoning and come to know about him. It's process initiated by Yahweh himself. Isaac,
Okay.
would you like to say something?
Yes, sir. Sir, you just talked about earlier that that equation of sin is equal to punishment, or righteousness is equal to blessings. But sir, he still got restoration of material things like blessing. That shows us that he humbled himself, and God like glorified him with the material things and blessed him with that. So I guess that kind of contradicts the thing that if we are humbling ourselves and putting God in first, and then if we are expecting the blessings of God, then is it okay to accept that thing? Because you just said that God has all sovereignty. He can give that, and he also can't, like, it's on him. So is it okay that we should accept after our sufferings, if we humble ourselves, that we will receive our blessing just as Job did? Or is it up to God?
I think I'm thinking how I would answer that clearly. Um, I think the key is to worship and obey God unconditionally. He knows our needs, as we know from Matthew. And Book of Job is a book for us, but Book of Job is not a paradigm for us in terms of Job's wealth. God restored Job, and material blessing was in the Old Testament indeed connected to God's blessing. But behind this was that Israelites, Job, everyone had a meaningful relationship with the Creator, with the Giver, not on the basis of if he gives or not, but just on the basis of who he is and who they are in relation to him. God does take care of his people, but that shouldn't be the primary motive that you should go to God. You can ask God, but you can never ask, or you should present your needs to God, and not expect God to give you extra blessings because you would like to compete with your friend or with your cousin in terms of material blessing. I think that's where the distinction lies. Are you approaching God for your needs? Yes, for sure you can. Are you using him as someone who will give you if you serve him? And that's the kind of attitude that the book tries to argue against.
So, sir, I have a question. By looking the book of Job, so someone can still suffer today like Job.
I think people do suffer like Job. Um, if you know the story of her, I forgot his name, the Spafford is that Dr. Bob? If you know, please correct the name. The Spafford family. Uh, the story behind "It Is Well with My Soul." Um,
Yeah, I don't know the name, but I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so it's a story of a man who lost everything in Chicago. He was a successful businessman, lost everything, and that story reminds me of Job. And you should look it up on YouTube. The story behind the hymn "It Is Well with My Soul." Everything was burned in a fire, and then he set his family to go to Paris on a boat, and he had last minute change in his schedule. He had to stay in Chicago. It's 19th century story. He had to stay in Chicago, and his family was traveling to Paris, and he had to join them later. but something hit the boat, and the boat sank, and all of his 4 children died in the sea at night, and only his wife survived, and his wife sent him a telegram, survived alone. And then he took the first ship to Europe from the US, and he, on the way, when he passed the place where his daughters died or his children died, he wrote the hymn, "It is well with my soul." And his life had more more sufferings afterwards as well. So there are people who suffer like Job. There are people in Pakistan who suffer like Job. There are quite a lot of Jobs in Pakistan whom I know, and this is a present reality. Um, but also, I'm sorry we do not have so much time. But I would like to. That takes us to the next point that I would like to emphasize as well. That how are Christians expecting the voice of God, or how they have expected and have received already the voice of God? How will our spiritual restoration and fulfillment will come and has already come? And that invites us as the reader of the Bible to the story of Jesus, and the comparison between Jesus and Job is very significant. A careful reader will never miss how Job's suffering and Jesus' suffering are very, very identical. So you have this in chapter in Philippians, which we do not have time to read, but you should read Paul's hymn of Jesus and his making himself humble. So from here, he was up in the heaven, he goes down, further down to the point of death, even death on a cross, and then from there he's risen above. So it's a V movement, and the same movement you see in the book of Job and in the life of every Christian who are suffering at this point, who have achieved a status with God through Jesus Christ, who are suffering, even despised in the world, and then going up in the eternity where we will be exalted as the church of Jesus Christ. Both Jesus and Job suffered unjustly. Scripture is very clear about both, and Job can be seen as a I wouldn't say prototype, as foreshadowing Jesus in some ways. I believe both of them are suffering unjustly. Both suffer for the glory of God, and both have mystery attached to their suffering. Gospel is to some extent mystery of God. Why did things happen this way? Many times Christians ask me, why did God lay out the plan of giving his son this way? And God's challenge is again to us, can you understand the mysteries of God? They are just simply some things that we do not understand, but we are called to have faith and believe in God's divine wisdom. Both Jesus and Job put the wise of their days, of their own times, to shame. The cross doesn't make sense in a Greco-Roman world because it's a shame to die on a cross. But the cross of Jesus speaks powerfully through weakness, and same is the life of Job, that he speaks to the wise of his own days very powerfully and puts them to shame. So the wisdom of the day is defeated in both cases. And I think these kind of comparisons invite us also to foresee our future, what we are going to have with Jesus Christ. And Revelation is one of the texts, which is Revelation chapter 21 is one of my favorite texts. It's not much time that I find this text again, but I paraphrase it for you, where the people of the Lamb will be with him, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and they will enjoy eternity with him in peace. And this is the group which has gone through tribulation, suffering, and pain. And we do anticipate this kind of spiritual restoration, which has also a dimension of peace, material wealth attached to it. I'm not saying we'll have wealth in heaven, but we will be satisfied mentally just being with the Lamb. And this brokenness of this world, these problems of not having enough and these kind of things will be solved in eternity. They will not matter anymore. So I believe that this restoration does await Christians, And like Job, Christians can anticipate this kind of restoration. Now, when people come to your church and ask you that they have real problems, you cannot tell them to look for future. Of course, this is the bigger reality. You should preach this in your church, but you have to be very careful with the sufferings of people in your church, because first of all, I think you have to be careful because every suffering does not come from God. You have to get this down. If you are overspeeding and you die, if you are driving your car on 200 kilometers and you die, I think you can still mourn. You can do all the human processes, but I think God has given us wisdom that we can avoid quite a lot of suffering. Secondly, and another example of this, I have personally seen many families, and I'm not targeting anyone, but this is my experience with Pakistani families, that people are suffering materially because they are competing with their families or with their friends. If their friends buy a bigger car and they do not have a bigger car, they are not suffering. Okay, so that's not, if some suffering is originating because of your selfish desires, I would tell people that you have enough. So this is
Weddings.
exactly,
That's
that's one
where
example.
people in Pakistan suffer, is weddings. They spend 4 lakh on a wedding. They don't have any money for anything, but they have to have a 4 lakh wedding. Otherwise, their family will persecute them until Jesus returns. Oh my gosh. Sorry,
Exactly.
just had to mention that.
No problem. Yeah, it's very important, very relevant example. And if your church family comes to you and tells you that my young son and daughter-in-law are still paying off the credit on the weddings, which they spent for 3 nights, and we are suffering, we do not have food, I would also help them in this situation, but have a serious talk and conversation with them on how to plan things. So these are examples of when suffering is not, when suffering is avoidable, or when you can use your mind to avoid this suffering. Now, there are other sufferings which you cannot avoid, and the Book of Job does answer them. For example, unfortunately, there are quite a lot of kids which are born with heart diseases, and that's one example that I can bring up, and is very is very serious. And parents ask, okay, why us? And that's the question every sufferer asks, why me? Uh, and that's one example, but there are just numbers of examples that you can bring up. And the Book of Job answers, and then the whole canon answers as well. The whole canon's answer is that we are in a broken world. We need to trust God. And the Book of Job really focuses on this second part, that we need to trust God and his wisdom, and he will deliver. And even if he doesn't, we have to say, it is well with my soul. And that's what Christians have to learn, to say, it is well with my soul, because it's not, when you suffer, you do not turn inwards, but outwards. If you become self-focused, then it doesn't help. You have to be outwards focused towards God and towards Jesus Christ. And I do not know any other worldly alternative that is better than this. No science can provide you answers to this kind of alternative. I think it's only the God of Bible that provides you this kind of assurance, even this kind of hope and assurance, even among miserable conditions. And that's the reality of the world. So we are also reaching our end. And finally, I would just like to mention that I do not expect you to read a lot of philosophy, but sometimes philosophy has to say good things to us as well, and we need to pick up the wisdom that God has given to me, given to them. And that's a quote very relevant to me, is by Jacques Derrida, in which he says that he's a French philosopher. He says that the religion needs to be saved from religion. And that's very relevant to our cultural practices of Christianity. Pastors have been preaching and telling people that your son is sick because you sin. I even know a story that a woman came to. I will quickly tell this too. This is very important and funny at the same time. But a woman came to my mom. He said that, oh, the pastor came to our house and we sold the furniture. And she said, why? because she said that we do not have enough money. And the pastor who came, he told us that this wood, the furniture which you have made out of the wood, it's taken from a tree where there were witches living on. The devil had possessed the tree, and you cut the tree, you make this couch, you sell this couch. And later the same preacher bought this couch as well. Well, so this kind of religion is what Jesus and God needs. Jesus and the message of gospel needs to be saved from. And I think this does much more damage than any other theory, any other worldly philosophy, because people just don't trust religion anymore and God anymore. And I think that's the sad reality. And we as future preachers, future Bible study holders, future teachers have to be very careful to see every suffering very critically and answer to them according to the book of Job, and then also according to what Jesus has done for us. And that's what I would invite you to. This is not an exhaustive knowledge of the book of Job, but I think this, at least in my understanding, this is the main framework. And maybe over years you read more and you get into the book of Job, and we have more insights also from you. And I'm open to listening to what you think now or later as well. So you're invited to ask questions, make remarks, anything you disagree
but
with.
not now. Not now, because
Okay.
I have a meeting in 5 minutes, and so we can't do
Okay.
anymore.
Okay, send
Sir,
me an
can you
email
send
if you need.
us that you shared the screen of points and the prologues overview?
Okay.
That will
Send
be
it to
helpful.
me.
I will send it to Dr. Bob, and
Oh,
then he can
Yes.
forward. Yeah.
That's very
Okay.
good.
thank you.
Okay, thank
So,
you so
all right.
much. I am so disappointed we only have 2 people. We have 2 great people, but I'm disappointed we don't have more people here to thank you. So we really appreciate it. I thought it was very good, valuable, informative, and helpful. Okay,
Yes,
so
that's true.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very
okay.
much.
So God bless you all. Take care. I'll see you tonight by the grace of God.
Sure. All right. Bye-bye.